The winter sun over Pine Hollow looked like a crack in a frozen pond. Down below, on the dusty main street, a woman named Illa May Carter walked with her 4 small children, each one of them barefoot, each one of them silent as a ghost. She'd been walking since before the sun came up, and the 28 miles had worn the soles of her feet down to raw, bleeding skin. Her youngest, a boy named Sam, was whimpering, his lips split and dry. In her hand, Illa clutched the only thing of value she had left in this world. A simple gold wedding ring. Its shine was gone, just like her hope. She stumbled into the general store, the little bell above the door barely making a sound. The men inside stopped talking. The store owner, a hard-faced woman named Wilma Granger, stared at Illa like she was something the cat dragged in. Illa's voice was a dry rasp. "Ma'am, please, I need food for my children." She held out the ring. "Will you buy this? It's all I have." Silence, thick and heavy. Mrs. Granger crossed her arms. "This ain't a pawn shop," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "Try the church." "I did," Illa whispered. "There's no one there." One of her boys, Toby, tugged on her dress. "Mama, I'm hungry." His voice was so small, it could have been carried away by the wind. A man at the counter cleared his throat. "Lady, you best move on. We don't like beggars here." Illa's shoulders slumped. She could feel her children's eyes locked on a loaf of bread behind the counter. She tried to stand tall, but the hunger was a knife in her ribs. Just then, the door creaked open again. A gust of cold wind blew in, and with it, a man. He was tall, quiet, his coat patched and worn. His hat was pulled down low, hiding his eyes. His name was Mikhail Boone. The town didn't talk to him much. They said he'd lost his wife a few winters back, and lost his voice along with her. He didn't seem to notice the cold stares. His eyes moved from Isla's bruised face to the starving children, and then they stopped. They locked onto the little gold ring in her trembling hand. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a few silver coins, and slapped them on the counter. "She'll take bread," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And beans, and whatever else you got that's warm." Mrs. Granger's eyes narrowed. "You know this woman, Mikhail?" He looked at Illa for a long second, his expression unreadable. "No, ma'am," he said, "but I know hunger, and I know trouble." Illa was stunned. "Sir, I can't take your charity," she managed to say, her pride fighting against the desperate gnawing in her belly. He finally looked her straight in the eyes. "It ain't charity," he said, and the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a promise of kindness. It was a statement of fact, a warning. He gathered the food into a sack himself, the children watching him like he was some kind of angel. Then he nodded toward the door. "Come on, I'll take you somewhere warm." As they walked out, Illa heard Mrs. Granger whisper behind them, sharp and venomous. "A widow and her kids, alone with that man. Shameful." The words stung, but the sack of food in her arms was heavy and real. Mikhail led them to an old wagon. He lifted her youngest boy into the back, with a strange gentleness, his rough hands careful. "We'll be home before dark," he murmured, and Illa realized she had no choice but to trust him. She and her children were climbing into a wagon with a complete stranger, a man the whole town seemed to fear, and they were heading out into the empty, frozen plains. As the wagon wheels creaked and the town disappeared behind them, Illa clutched her children close. She had no idea if she was riding toward salvation or something far, far worse. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of blood and violet. The ride was silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the low whistle of the wind. The world was a vast, empty canvas of white, and Illa felt impossibly small. Just when she thought the cold would seep into her bones for good, she saw it. A tiny flicker of light in the distance, a cabin nestled by a frozen creek, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney like a prayer. The warmth inside was the first thing that hit her. It was like a physical touch, a mercy she hadn't felt in months. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was clean and smelled of pine and wood smoke. A pot of stew bubbled over the hearth. "It ain't much," Mikhail said, his voice still that low rumble, "but it'll fill your bellies." The children ate like wolves, their small hands shaking as they held the spoons. Ela watched them, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, until she realized Mikhail was watching her. She quickly turned away, ashamed of her own hunger, ashamed of her tears. "You should eat too," he said. She took only a little, her throat tight. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll work to repay you. I can cook. I can mend." He cut her off, his voice firm. "You're not my servant, ma'am." "Then what am I?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his grey eyes. "A guest," he said slowly, "who's had too long a walk." The simple words broke something inside her. After so much cruelty, this quiet, unexpected kindness felt heavier than any stone. She thought she had no more tears left to cry, but she was wrong. Later, after the children were asleep, curled in blankets by the fire, a fragile silence settled between them. Ila sat stiffly in a chair, still clutching the wedding ring in her hand. Mikhail leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, the shadows hiding his face. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Nowhere," she whispered. "Nowhere left to go. My husband died. The landlord said we were behind on rent. Then some men came. They told us to get out." Her voice broke on the last words. She didn't tell him the worst of it. The way they'd looked at her, the things they'd said. She saw his jaw tighten, a muscle flexing in the firelight. The quiet fury in his eyes was terrifying. "Nobody's going to touch you here," he said, and it sounded like an oath. "You don't even know me," she breathed. "Don't need to," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "I just know you've been hurt enough." Later that night, Ila tried to sleep, but she couldn't. The warmth of the cabin felt foreign, the safety of it fragile. She stirred and saw him, sitting by the door, a shotgun resting against the wall beside him. He wasn't sleeping. He was standing watch. "You don't have to do that, sir," she whispered into the darkness. He was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't name, "a man sleeps better knowing someone else is safe." Her heart gave a painful lurch. "You lost someone," she said, more a statement than a question. He nodded once, a sharp, curt movement in the shadows. "Winter takes what it wants." In that moment, she saw his loneliness as clearly as she saw her own. Two broken souls, huddled around a fire in the middle of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. The wind howled outside, clawing at the walls of the small cabin. She watched him, this silent, watchful man who had appeared out of nowhere. "You could have left me there," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Could have," he agreed, his voice flat. "Didn't want to." Something in his tone, so simple, so final, made her chest ache. He got up to add another log to the fire, and as the flames roared back to life, the orange light washed over the room. It illuminated the sleeping faces of her children, her own tired face, the bruises on her arms she'd tried to hide. He saw it all. He saw everything. And he just stood there, his face a mask of stone. But Illa saw something else in his eyes as he looked at her. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "You and them will be safe here," he said, turning away abruptly. "Even if the town talks?" she asked quietly. He paused at the door. "Let 'em talk. Folks got too much time and not enough kindness." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Kindness can be costly." "Some things," he said without turning around, "are worth the cost." When he stepped outside to check on the horses, she watched him from the doorway. The moon was high now, casting a silver light on the snow, outlining his broad shoulders. He looked back at her, just for a second, their eyes meeting across the frozen yard. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then disappeared into the barn. Illa stayed in the doorway, the cold air on her face, the gold ring suddenly feeling warm in her hand. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a tiny, terrifying flicker of hope ignited in her chest. She didn't know this man, she didn't know his secrets. But as the snow began to fall again, dusting the world in a fresh blanket of white, she knew one thing for certain. Her journey hadn't ended at this cabin. It had just begun, and the storm was far from over. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Illa cooked and cleaned, trying to make the small cabin feel like a home. Mikhail worked from sunup to sundown, chopping wood, mending fences, his movements always purposeful, his silence a constant brooding presence. The children, however, began to thaw. Their laughter, at first hesitant, then loud and clear, started to fill the empty spaces in the cabin, chasing away the ghosts that had haunted it for so long. Illa found herself watching Mikhail, studying the lines on his face, the sadness in his eyes that never seemed to leave. He was kind to her children, carving them small wooden animals, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle. But with her, he kept a careful distance. They were two people sharing a space, but their worlds never quite touched. One afternoon, as Illa was mending one of his shirts, she noticed a small, intricate pattern stitched into the collar, almost hidden. It was a single stylized flower, a bluebell. She ran her fingers over it, a strange feeling prickling her skin. Later that evening, as Mikhail was cleaning his rifle by the fire, she found the courage to ask. "This flower," she said, holding up the shirt, "it's beautiful." He froze, his hands stilling their work. He stared at the shirt, and for a moment the mask he wore so well cracked. A flicker of raw pain crossed his face before he shuttered it away. "My wife," he said, his voice tight. "Ilara. She liked to sew them on my things, said it was so I'd always find my way back home." The name hung in the air between them. Ilara. Illa's heart ached for this silent, grieving man, but before she could say anything, he looked up and his eyes weren't on the shirt anymore. They were on the ring she still wore on a string around her neck. "That ring," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Where did you say you got it?" "It was my husband's," she said, confused by his sudden intensity. "He gave it to me." "Your husband," Mikhail said, his voice flat. "What was his name?" "John," she whispered. "John Carter." Mikhail stood up slowly, his tall frame blocking out the firelight. He walked over to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room, a chest Illa had never seen him open. He lifted the lid, and the scent of cedar and old memories filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a small, faded tintype photograph. He held it out to her. "Is this him?" he asked. Illa's breath caught in her throat. The man in the photograph was younger, his face unlined by hardship, but it was him. It was her John. Standing next to him was a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a bluebell tucked into her hair. It was the woman from the stories, Ilara. But that wasn't the most shocking part. On Ilara's hand, clear as day in the faded photograph, was a gold ring. A gold ring with a small, unique flaw in the band, a tiny nick near the setting. The exact same flaw that was in the ring hanging around Illa's neck. Her ring. Ilara's ring. The room started to spin. "I don't understand," she stammered, backing away. John told me he bought it for me." Mikhail's face was grim, his eyes like chips of ice. "My wife was murdered 2 winters ago," he said, his voice raw. "Robbed. They took everything of value, including her wedding ring." He took a step closer, his shadow engulfing her. "The men who did it were never found. The same winter your husband died." The implication hit her like a physical blow. Her John. The man she had loved, the father of her children. A thief. A killer. No, it couldn't be true, but the proof was right there, in the photograph, on the ring. "He wouldn't," she sobbed. "He wasn't that kind of man." "What kind of man was he, Illa?" Mikhail's voice was relentless. "You said men came, that they threw you out. Were they landlords? Or were they looking for something?" Illa flashed back to that terrible day. The men hadn't just been angry about rent. They had torn the house apart, ripped up floorboards, yelling about a debt. about something John had stolen. They had been looking for something. Something more than just rent money. They had been looking for the ring. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her husband hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been involved in something terrible, and he had dragged her and her children into it with him. The man standing in front of her wasn't her savior. He was the husband of the woman her own husband had wronged. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. And she was locked inside with a man who had every reason to hate her, every reason to want revenge. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind began to howl again, a mournful, lonely sound. The sound of secrets being unearthed. Illa backed away from him, her hand flying to the ring around her neck. Her children were sleeping peacefully by the fire, oblivious to the storm that had just broken inside the cabin. "It can't be," she whispered, her mind reeling. "John was a good man, he was." "He was what, Illa?" Mikhail's voice was hard, cutting through her denial. He was in debt. He was desperate. Desperate men do things they wouldn't normally do. He wasn't yelling. His voice was quiet, controlled, and that was somehow more terrifying. He looked at her tear-streaked face, at the children, and something in his expression shifted. The hard anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "I've been hunting the men who killed her for 2 years," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I followed their trail to this town. I knew they were looking for something they didn't find that night. I just never knew what." He looked at the ring. "Until now." He wasn't looking at her like an enemy anymore. He was looking at her like a fellow victim. Another piece in a puzzle he was finally starting to solve. "Those men," Illa said, her voice shaking, "the ones who came to my house. They'll come back, won't they? They're still looking for it." Mikhail nodded slowly. "They won't stop until they find it." He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the past 2 years etched into every line. "Your husband. He didn't just steal a ring, Ilara. She had discovered something happening in this county. Men were losing their land. Families were being forced out. She found proof. A ledger. She kept it hidden." He looked around the small cabin. "I thought they killed her for this land. But it was never about the land. It was about what she knew." The truth was a cold, bitter pill. John hadn't just been a thief. He'd been a coward. He'd stumbled into a conspiracy, stolen the evidence, and then died, leaving Illa and his children to face the consequences. The ring wasn't just a piece of gold, it was a target, and it was hanging around her neck. "What do we do?" she asked, the question hanging in the silent room. "We can't stay here." "No," Mikhail said. "Running is what your husband did. It didn't save him. It won't save you." He walked to the window and looked out at the endless snow-covered plains. "The men who are doing this, they're powerful. They have people in their pocket, probably the law." He turned back to face her, his decision made. "There's only one way to end this. We have to find that ledger. We have to expose them." It was insane, a grieving rancher and a penniless widow against a powerful, ruthless enemy. They didn't stand a chance, but as Illa looked at her sleeping children, she knew he was right. They couldn't run forever. She owed it to them to fight. She owed it to the woman in the photograph, the woman whose ring she now wore. "The ledger," she said, her mind racing. "John must have hidden it. The men who came to the house, they tore everything apart. If it was there, they would have found it." "Maybe it wasn't in the house," Mikhail said, his eyes thoughtful. He looked at the ring again. Ilara was clever. She loved puzzles, riddles. Nothing was ever as it seemed with her. He took the ring from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He examined it in the firelight, turning it over and over. "This isn't just a ring," he murmured. "It's a key." He ran his thumb over the band, pressing on the small, flawed nick that Illa had always thought was just a sign of age. There was a faint click. A tiny, almost invisible seam appeared, and the top of the ring popped open. It was a locket, and inside, nestled in the tiny compartment, wasn't a picture. It was a miniature, tightly folded piece of paper. A map. It was a crude drawing of the area around Pine Hollow, with a series of numbers and a single cryptic symbol marked in the corner. the same bluebell flower that was stitched into his shirt collar. The creek, Mikhail breathed, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. The old willow by the creek bend. It was her favorite spot. Hope, fierce and dangerous, surged through him. After 2 years of hunting in the dark, he finally had a lead. But it was a lead that painted an even bigger target on their backs. At that moment, the old hound sleeping by the hearth lifted its head and let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes fixed on the cabin door. Outside, in the distance, came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They were coming. The men from her house. They had found them. The fragile piece of the cabin shattered. Mikhail moved with a speed that was terrifying. He grabbed his shotgun from the wall and shoved it into Illa's hands. "Take the children," he hissed. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards, behind the woodpile. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" she cried, her heart pounding against her ribs. He didn't answer. He was already checking the load in his rifle, his face a grim mask of determination. The quiet, grieving farmer was gone. In his place was a man ready for war. The hoofbeats were closer now, the sound of at least 3 horses. They were slowing, stopping just outside the cabin. A rough voice called out, "Boone, we know you're in there. We know you have the woman." Another voice laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Send her out, and we might just let you live. We only want what she owes us." Ila scrambled to wake the children, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. She herded them towards the woodpile, their eyes wide with fear. She pulled back the rug, found the heavy wooden door to the cellar, and guided them down into the cold, damp darkness. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Be brave." She closed the door over their heads, plunging them into blackness. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't hide while he faced them alone. She was a part of this now. She gripped the heavy shotgun, the cold metal a shocking weight in her hands, and crept to the window. Through a crack in the shutters, she could see them. 3 of them. Hard, brutal-looking men, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a torch one of them held. They were the same men who had terrorized her, who had driven her from her home. And standing slightly behind them, half hidden in the shadows, was a 4th figure. A man on a horse, his face obscured by the darkness. He wasn't one of the thugs. He was watching, directing. A voice from the darkness called out, and Illa's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. It was the voice of Sheriff Dunning. "Last chance, Boone," the sheriff yelled. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Mikhail didn't answer. The silence stretched, tight and brittle. Then one of the men got impatient. He swung his leg over his saddle and started walking toward the cabin door, a confident smirk on his face. "Fine," he sneered. "We'll do this the hard way." He kicked the door. The wood splintered but held. He kicked it again, harder this time. With a loud crack, the door flew open. The man stepped inside, silhouetted against the snowy night. For a second, nothing happened. Then a deafening roar exploded from the darkness inside the cabin. The man was thrown backward, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He hit the snow and didn't move. Chaos erupted. The other 2 men scrambled for cover, firing their pistols blindly into the cabin. Bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls, splintering wood, shattering the single glass window pane. Illa screamed, pressing herself flat against the floor, the shotgun useless in her trembling hands. This was it. This was where they were all going to die. She heard Mikhail cry out in pain. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw him stumble back from the doorway, clutching his arm. Blood was seeping through his fingers. He was hit. He tried to raise his rifle again, but his arm gave out. He was vulnerable. One of the remaining men saw his chance. He charged forward, a long hunting knife gleaming in the torchlight. Illa's mind went blank with terror. She couldn't let him die. Not after everything. Not for her husband's mistakes. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun, the one Mikhail had shoved into her hands. It was heavy, awkward. She closed her eyes, pointed it in the direction of the charging man, and pulled the trigger. The kickback slammed her into the wall, the sound a physical blow. When she opened her eyes, the second man was on the ground, groaning. She hadn't killed him, but she had stopped him. The third man, seeing his partners down, hesitated. He looked from Illa to the wounded Mikhail, and then back to the shadowy figure of the sheriff. That hesitation cost him. Mikhail, grimacing in pain, had managed to switch his rifle to his good arm. He fired once. The third man dropped. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the torch on the ground and the groaning of the wounded man. Sheriff Dunning, who had watched the entire thing from the safety of the darkness, slowly urged his horse forward. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You fool, Boone," he spat. "You should have just given her up. It was never about her, was it?" Mikhail grunted, leaning heavily against the wall. "It was always about the ledger." The sheriff laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That ledger has kept me and my business partners very comfortable for a long time. We couldn't let some farmer's wife and a half-wit accountant ruin that." His eyes landed on Illa, who was still on the floor, shaking, the shotgun lying beside her. "And now you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've seen too much. You all have." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Mikhail. Ila screamed, but before the sheriff could fire, a small figure darted out from behind the cabin. It was Toby, her oldest boy. He must have snuck out of the cellar during the chaos. In his hand, he held a small carved wooden horse, the one Mikhail had made for him. With a cry of rage, Toby threw the toy as hard as he could. It was a child's desperate act, a meaningless gesture, but it was enough. The wooden horse struck the sheriff's horse in the face. The animal spooked, rearing up on its hind legs with a terrified whinny. The sheriff's shot went wide, burying itself in the ceiling of the cabin. He fought to control his mount, cursing. That 1 second of distraction was all Mikhail needed. He lunged forward, ignoring the searing pain in his arm, and tackled the sheriff, dragging him from the saddle. The two men crashed to the snowy ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. The sheriff was bigger, stronger, but Mikhail was driven by 2 years of grief and a burning need for justice. They rolled in the snow, trading blows. The sheriff's pistol had fallen, half buried in a drift. Both men scrambled for it. Illa watched, frozen in horror, as her son ran to her side. She pulled him close, shielding him with her body. The fight was brutal, primal. Finally, Mikhail got the upper hand. He pinned the sheriff down, his one good hand locked around the man's throat. "Who?" Mikhail roared, his face inches from the sheriff's. "Who are your partners? Who gave the order?" The sheriff choked, his face turning purple. He clawed at Mikhail's hand, but the rancher's grip was like iron. "Granger!" the sheriff gasped. "Wilma Granger's husband. He runs the whole thing." Ila's mind flashed back to the store, to Mrs. Granger's cold eyes, her husband's dismissive tone. They weren't just cruel. They were monsters, hiding in plain sight, running the town, destroying lives. And Ilara had found them out. "It's over, Dunning," Mikhail said, his voice ragged. He picked up the sheriff's pistol and stood, swaying on his feet, the gun trained on the man who had betrayed everything he was sworn to protect. The fight was over. They had survived. But the truth was out now, a poison that had infected the entire town of Pine Hollow. And the real battle had only just begun. The dawn broke cold and grey, the rising sun casting a sickly light on the scene of carnage outside the cabin. 2 men lay dead in the snow. A third was tied up groaning, his leg shattered by the shotgun blast. Sheriff Dunning sat slumped against a wagon wheel, his hands bound, his face a mess of bruises and defeated rage. Inside, Illa was tending to Mikhail's arm. The bullet had gone clean through, but he'd lost a lot of blood. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were clear and hard. The children were huddled by the fire, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale with shock. They had seen too much, lived through a nightmare that would haunt them forever. "Granger," Mikhail said, his voice raspy. "I should have known. He owns half the county, buys up failing farms for pennies on the dollar. I just never thought that he was creating the failing farms himself." Illa finished for him, her voice numb. "Forcing people out, murdering them if they got in the way." She tied the bandage tight, her movements surprisingly steady. The terror of the night had burned away. leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor, and she wanted justice. "The ledger," she said, pulling the tiny map from the locket. "We have to get it." Mikhail shook his head. "No, I have to get it. You have to take the children and get as far away from here as you can. Go north. Don't stop until you reach the territories." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw not a fragile widow, but a woman as strong and unyielding as the land itself. He gave a slow nod. "All right," he said, "but we do it my way." Their plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. They would ride into Pine Hollow, not as fugitives, but as accusers. They would confront Granger in his own store, in front of the whole town. They would expose the rot at the heart of their community. It was a suicide mission. Granger had the town in his pocket. Dunning was his puppet. Who would believe a reclusive rancher and a penniless drifter? "They'll believe this," Mikhail said. He took the locket ring, the tiny map still inside, and pressed it into her hand. "Ilara's last words to me. She said the bluebell will show the way, that the truth is buried under its roots." He looked Illa straight in the eye. "She trusted me to finish what she started. Now, I'm trusting you." He explained the rest of the plan. He would ride in first, drawing their attention. He would be the distraction. That would give her time to get to the creek, to find the old willow tree, and to unearth the ledger. "Once you have it," he said, "go straight to the church. The preacher, Reverend Michael. He was a friend of Ilara's. He's the only one in that town I trust. Give it to him. He'll know what to do." Illa's heart pounded. He was asking her to leave him, to ride into the lion's den alone. But she knew he was right. It was the only way. She gathered her children, her heart breaking as she explained that she had to leave, but that she would be back for them. Toby, her brave little boy, just nodded. "You go get 'em, Mama," he said, his small face serious. She saddled one of the horses, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. She kissed each of her children, promising them she would return. Then she looked at Mikhail. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his arm in a sling, his face pale but resolute. No words were needed. Their eyes said everything. It was a silent promise, a pact sealed in blood and grief. She turned the horse and rode, not looking back. She rode towards Pine Hollow, towards the creek, with the fate of two families resting on her shoulders. The willow tree was ancient, its branches weeping over the frozen creek, just as Mikhail had described. A small, carved bluebell on the trunk marked the spot. Illa dismounted, her hands raw from the cold as she began to dig in the frozen earth with a branch. It felt hopeless. The ground was like iron, but she thought of her children, of Mikhail facing Granger alone, of Ilara, and she dug with a frantic energy born of desperation. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her fingers were numb, bleeding. Finally, she hit something hard, a small, oilcloth-wrapped package, the ledger. She tore it open, page after page of names, dates, and figures, all in Ilara's neat, precise handwriting. It was all there, the proof of Granger's entire criminal enterprise. She had it. Meanwhile, in Pine Hollow, the town was buzzing. The sight of Mikhail Boone riding down the main street, his arm in a blood-soaked sling, a rifle across his lap, was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. He didn't stop, didn't slow down. He rode straight to the general store and dismounted. He kicked open the door and stepped inside. Wilma Granger was behind the counter, her husband beside her. They looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. "Boone," Mr. Granger said, his voice smooth as oil. To what do we owe the pleasure? The pleasure is all mine, Granger, Mikhail said, his voice low and dangerous. He let his rifle slide into his good hand. We need to talk. About my wife. The store went silent. The handful of customers slowly backed away, their eyes wide. Mrs. Granger's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. Oh, I think you do, Mikhail said. He took a step forward. I think you know all about the night she died. You and your husband, and your pet sheriff. Just then, the door swung open again. But it wasn't Illa. It was a group of Granger's hired men, the same kind of thugs who had attacked the cabin. They had been waiting. It was an ambush. They surrounded Mikhail, their guns drawn. Mr. Granger smiled, a cold, triumphant smirk. You should have stayed on your ranch, Boone, he said. This town has a way of dealing with troublemakers. Mikhail didn't even flinch. He just smiled a slow, grim smile. You're right, he said. It does. And at that exact moment, the bell of the town church began to toll. Slow, steady, solemn. A death knell. Granger's head whipped around, a look of confusion on his face. Then the sound started. A low rumble at first, then growing louder. The sound of dozens of people. The townspeople. They were pouring out of their homes, out of the saloon, drawn by the church bell. They were gathering in the street, their faces grim, angry. At the front of the crowd was Reverend Michael, and standing beside him, holding a weathered ledger in her hands, was Illa May Carter. She had done it. She had gotten the proof. And the preacher had rallied the town. The people who had been too scared to speak up, the families who had lost everything to Granger, they weren't scared anymore. They were a mob, and they wanted justice. Mr. Granger's face turned ashen. His hired guns looked nervously at the sea of angry faces surrounding the store. The trap he had set for Mikhail had just become his own cage. The tables had turned. The reckoning had come to Pine Hollow. The standoff was electric. Inside the store, Granger and his men were trapped. Outside, the entire town waited, their silence more menacing than any shout. Reverend Michael stepped forward, his voice booming across the street. Jedediah Granger, your sins have found you out. The blood of the innocent cries out from the ground. He held up the ledger. We have the proof. We know what you did to Alara Boone. We know what you've done to all of us. Granger, cornered like a rat, panicked. He grabbed his wife, pulling her in front of him as a shield. Stay back, he screamed. All of you, stay back. But the crowd surged forward, their anger breaking like a dam. They flooded into the store. Granger's men, seeing that the fight was lost, threw down their weapons and surrendered. In the chaos, Granger tried to make a break for the back door, dragging his wife with him. But Mikhail was there to block his path. The two men stared at each other for a long second, the rancher who had lost everything, and the man who had taken it. There was no big fight, no dramatic showdown. Mikhail just raised his rifle, and with the cold, calm precision of a man delivering a long-overdue justice, he shot Granger in the leg. Granger screamed and collapsed, clutching his shattered knee. It was over. The townspeople dragged him and his wife out into the street. They rounded up Sheriff Dunning and the other wounded man from the cabin. The poison that had infected Pine Hollow had been cut out. Illa pushed through the crowd and ran to Mikhail. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight with his one good arm, the strength of his embrace saying more than words ever could. They had done it. They had faced the storm and won. They had brought the truth to light. In the days that followed, Pine Hollow began to heal. Federal marshals arrived and took Granger and his conspirators away in chains. The land that had been stolen was returned to its rightful owners. The town, humbled and ashamed of its willful blindness, looked at Mikhail and Illa with a newfound respect. They were no longer outcasts. They were heroes. A week later, they stood in the small white church at the end of the street. The children were there, their faces bright and full of hope for the first time. The church was packed with the people of the town, their faces soft with gratitude. Reverend Michael stood before them, a gentle smile on his face. "Do you have the ring?" he asked. Illa looked down at her hand. She was still wearing Ilara's ring, the locket ring that had started it all. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she whispered. Mikhail reached into his pocket. He pulled out a simple, unadorned gold band, the one Ila had tried to sell in the general store all those weeks ago. He'd gone back and bought it from Mrs. Granger's leftover stock. He took Ila's hand, and as the sunlight streamed through the church windows, he slid the ring onto her finger. It wasn't a symbol of a past life filled with secrets and lies. It was a symbol of a new beginning, a future forged not in gold, but in courage, sacrifice, and a love that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. As they walked out of the church, the bells rang out, not as a warning this time, but as a celebration. The people of Pine Hollow cheered. Mikhail helped Illa and the children into the wagon. "You sure about this life?" he asked, a rare, small smile touching his lips. She looked at him, at this quiet, strong man who had walked through hell for her, and for the memory of a woman he'd loved. She looked at her children, safe and happy. "It's the only one I want," she said, her voice filled with a peace she had thought she would never know again. He clucked the reins, and the wagon started down the dusty street, heading back towards the small cabin by the creek, heading home. Years later, the story of the silent rancher and the starving widow became a legend in Pine Hollow. They said he saved her from poverty, and she saved him from his grief. But those who were there that winter knew it was more than that. They knew that two broken people, brought together by a tragic secret, had found the strength in each other to fight for justice, to heal a broken town, and to build a family from the ashes of the past. They proved that sometimes the most powerful love isn't the one that's spoken in pretty words, but the one that's proven in the fire. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, hit that subscribe button and get ready for the next story, because the shadows are full of them, just waiting for someone to turn on the light.